So we've talked about Abraham, we've talked about Isaac, and today we're moving on. We're going to finish up with Jacob. What we're going to see is that Jacob is a much, much different character, both in his grandfather Abraham or his father Isaac. So let's hop right into this story. We pick up with Jacob. He gets born in chapter 25. So if y'all just want to open to that. Starting with verses 19 and onward. And we get this nice little narrative of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah having these sons, right? And this is the part where Isaac actually gets to do something, right? Because Rebekah is barren, right? And remember kind of what we equated barrenness with before in the ancient Near East? Right. Right? You are not able to fill and multiply the earth if you are barren. Right? So here we have Rebekah being barren. And Isaac prays for her, and the text tells us that God listens and enables her to become pregnant. Right? So here we have the children of Rebekah being a divine action, right? This is a gift. Right? Whenever someone prays for someone who is barren and that person is able to have children, when this is kind of turned, right, this is an act of God. And that's kind of what the text is wanting us to see, is that the birth of Esau and Jacob, this is a divine act. Right? God has a part in this. However, Esau and Jacob don't really start out liking each other. It's not just because this is a divine act that here we have like two angels being born of Rebekah. Because notice what it says. Let's see here in verse...
Was it 25?
Should be 25. Yeah, 25. Starting with verse 19. It says in verse 22, the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is to be this way, why do I live? Right. Now there's struggle within her because, as we come to see, Jacob takes the place in mythology in a certain sense, even though we're not really dealing with mythology much here, of the trickster. Right? Jacob is kind of our classic trickster. One who seeks to get ahead not through work or wisdom, but through trickery. Okay, and we see this from the very start. His character is laid out from the very start because this conflict that is going on within Rebekah's womb is for who will be firstborn. Right? And we see that as they are being born, where it tells us after his brother came out, after Esau came out, this is verse 26, with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Right? So Esau was born first. Afterward, his brother Jacob came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel. And his name is connected with the idea of gripping the heel, of trying to be the firstborn. Now, why is it important to be the firstborn? Why does that matter? Because does that matter today?
Yeah.
It does?
Not necessarily that much.
Does it legally matter?
No.
Not legally, but firstborn usually get the inheritance and stuff like that. That's
Okay, sometimes.
For like royalty, they
Well,
would
this
pass on
is
their
kinda like
heirs.
the
the
strong
firstborn.
arm.
the estate.
Good. With the firstborn, and it's no different from, say, Middle Ages or even sometimes today, it's got a fancy word, it's called primogeniture, which is where the firstborn, the prime, right, the firstborn, inherits the family's wealth, the family's property, right? And this is what the birthright is, right? The birthright of the firstborn is to inherit what is the family's. And this goes towards the firstborn male. Okay, and this belongs to the firstborn. So here we see, in a sense, Jacob, as he's coming out, is trying to lay claim to this birthright on his own. Right? And what we'll see as well is what also gets given the firstborn is the blessing. And the blessing is different from the birthright. The birthright we can think of as property. The blessing is the status of the head of the home, or the head of the household, or the head of the family. I think mafia style here.
The Don.
Yeah, you get to be the Don. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Both of these are accorded, even in Israelite society, to the firstborn. We see this if you want to go and find this in the Hebrew text. It's in Deuteronomy 21. Is where it lays out that both of these things should be given the firstborn, given to the firstborn. So in a sense, what we see here, and what Jacob kind of symbolizes here, is grasping for the promise. Right? In the same way that he is grasping for his brother's heel, he is grasping to be the one who inherits this promise. But remember, he's doing this not in a respectable way where he is striving for it. He's doing it through trickery, right? Through grasping at his brother's heel, symbolically to try to pull him back in the womb so that he could be the firstborn. Okay? And we see him, seeing how he's not able to do this, as an infant, he does, through trickery, get these two things from his brother. Right? We get a story of Esau coming in and being hungry, and Jacob says, well, I'll give you some stew if you just give me your birthright. And Esau, being the kind of animalistic person that he's portrayed to be in the text, is like, sure, whatever. Right? Has no really deep thoughts about this or worries about this, just says, yes, I'm hungry to the point of death, just take it, whatever, I just need some food. Right? And so he's tricked out of his birthright. And then later we see Jacob also tricking Esau out of his blessing, while Isaac is laying there about to pass away and has gone blind, right? Jacob comes up to him, kind of emulating his brother Esau, and is able to take the blessing from his father as well.
So which one was born first?
Esau is born first. Esau is the one to whom the birthright and the blessing technically belong. But Jacob takes both of these away from him through trickery. What is important to kind of think about as Jacob is taking all of this from his brother is that Jacob is kind of seen as wanting the benefit without the covenant. And that gets highlighted a couple times in the text very acutely. That he just wants what would come along, he wants these good things without the responsibility of the covenant. Right? Without having to be in this particular relationship with the God of his father Isaac and the God of Abraham. Now let's turn to 28:13. Kind of turn back from that verse, or chapter 31. We turn back to 28 and look at verse 13. Again, kind of looking into Jacob's character. And this is really important to do when we're kind of looking at these biblical stories, is to look at these characters and how they're being presented to us. If you look at verse 13, it says, and the Lord stood beside him, right, stood beside Jacob, and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and the east and the north and south, and so on. Right? What is this a repetition of?
Be fruitful and multiply.
Fruitful and multiply, but also that covenant promise, right? I'm going to make your descendants multiple, and I'm giving you this land. Right? Let's see here. Know that I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go. Right? This huge blessing. Then Jacob woke from his sleep. Right? This is all in a dream. Jacob wakes from his sleep and says, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he builds a altar there. Let's see here. Making sure I've got my little passages straight. Yeah, then turn over to 20. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me, and will keep me in the way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Compare this to Abram, right? Before he was Abraham even. Compare this to Abram. When God said go, he went. Right? Now we have Jacob making a vow and saying if.
Yeah.
Right? There's all these conditionals on that relationship in the text. Right? If he keeps me, if he takes care of me, if he gives me bread to eat, then he'll be my God.
Jacob need to get it together.
Right. And that's what the text is showing us. The text is showing us this person who does not want to be bound by this totally. Right? Has these conditions, wants these benefits. Right? And this is the kind of character we're getting. So it's interesting, like, compare all of these characters so far. Like Abram, who's like faithful maybe to a fault. Right? Then we get Isaac, whose identity is mainly focused on who he is rather than what he does. And now we get this character Jacob, who's so far in the text, nobody likes. Right? And that's the whole point. Like, it's important to read these texts and not be like, oh, Jacob's supposed to be a good guy. Let's just like all like him. You know, like the text is presenting him very negatively, and it's doing it on purpose. Because it is setting us up for the story that happens in, I think here, 28 and following that. When Jacob is going now to meet his brother Esau. Okay.
That's in chapter 28?
It starts in 28, right? It's when he starts going back towards Esau. And this is the only part where we start seeing Jacob start turning towards God, right? He says, let's see. At one point, he's kind of turning towards God and reminding God of that blessing, right? Of that promise. And he's doing this in a sense, like he's only turning towards God when he's feeling in danger. He's like, oh no, I'm in danger now. I'm going to confront my brother who's much bigger and stronger than I am. Has a lot more men on his side because remember, as Jacob has run away, he's accumulated quite a bit through Laban. But it's Esau who, at the present, is kind of inheriting as the head of Abraham's household, which is much larger. Right? So little Jacob is going to confront big old Esau and is kind of turning to God out of desperation at this point. What's that?
I was thinking that one.
Okay. And he's kind of scared. So what Jacob does is he sends all this stuff across this river before he's about to meet Esau, right? Esau, we have this river, and we have Esau on one side, and Jacob's on the other, and he knows Esau's over there, right? Interestingly enough, this river is referred to as the Jabbok River, which, if we look at it in Hebrew, also kind of bears Jacob's name. Right? Interestingly enough. In Hebrew, I think, we're leaving out a letter in the Hebrew, but you can kind of see the similarity between the two. Right? Which is intentional. And what we get is an incredibly interesting story that I want us to look at. And let's see here. In chapter 32. All right, this is where you see there's probably a heading, Jacob sends presents to appease Esau. Then if we start in 22, we get this story of a wrestling match at Peniel. Okay. In chapter 32, verse 22. Now, looking down to 24, right, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Who is Jacob wrestling with?
Esau or angel.
All right, let's think about reading in Genesis when we read about the garden, and we said, okay, there's a snake, Who is it? And we all kind of think Lucifer, even though
Right.
it just says a snake in the text. Who is the text say Jacob is wrestling with right now?
Man.
Good. It even uses the word Ish, which we've come across before. Remember Ish and Isha? Man and woman? It just says Ish. It just says a man. Right? At this point in the text. Right? And we'll see how the text kind of muddies this up for us. But at this moment, we just have Jacob wrestling a man, which is supposed to be that is a very intentional move by the text. We are not supposed to imagine some angelic being coming and wrestling. If we notice just a little bit earlier with the angels ascending and descending upon the ladder, right? Remember in Jacob's ladder, that dream that we talked about with the ziggurats? The text is very comfortable saying angels, right? The text is very comfortable saying God. The text does not use either of those words here. The text just says man, right? And so we have Jacob wrestling this man, and they're kind of bound in this struggle together. Neither one of them can win, right? And as day is about to break, the man says, "Let me go." And Jacob's response is, "I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me." Again, this trickster attitude kind of coming out. I'm not going to let you go unless I get something from this. Right? What is the man's response?
He struck him in the hip socket.
Not yet. He asks him his name.
What's your name?
Right? And he responds, Jacob. And the man says, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Right? Again, this passage is not yet telling us that Jacob is here wrestling with God. His whole life is, in a sense, wrestling with this covenant identity. Right? And wrestling with other people. Right? Tricking his brother, tricking his father, tricking his uncle. Right? Trying to evade this kind of covenant relationship, while at the same time just getting all the benefits of the covenant relationship.
He struck him in the hip before he asked him what his name was.
Yes, yes. And this is in a sense so that that man can get away, right? He's like, I'm going to strike him on the hip, kind of wound him to the point that I can get out of here, right? But Jacob holds on still, right? And that hip idea is going to come up here in a bit. But instead of blessing him, in a sense, the man asks Jacob his name and then renames him, right? Again, let's think back to the significance in the ancient Near East of naming, right? The man renames Jacob Israel. If you think back to the names for God in the ancient Near East and the ways that the Israelites and other cultures would refer to God, right? El being God, and Yisra meaning to struggle with. Right? So he's naming him Israel because that's what his name means, right? He is, in a sense, giving him this new identity. He is no longer just someone who supplants others, who grasps for the heel. He is now one that struggles with God. Right? Now, keep this in mind as, remember, we are thinking about how the text is conveying Israel's, the people of Israel's, self-identity through these characters. Okay. And then it continues. Jacob asks, "Please tell me your name." Right? Now, in a sense, what's interesting here is Jacob then asks him for his name, and the man never responds. Right? He says, "Why is it that you asked my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, for he said, "I've seen the face of God, and yet my life is preserved." Right? So the man with whom Jacob is wrestling does not give him his name. Right? And yet Jacob kind of makes this assumption that here I have encountered God. Right? In the Hebrew mindset, you cannot see the face of God without living. Right?
Without dying.
And we'll see this show up with Moses especially. So one possible idea about thinking about why the man never reveals his name is that if we are to think of this character as God, there's a sense in which God is not to be renamed. right? There's a sense that God is saying, no, you will not rename me, right? To name is not just to give an identity, but to exercise some amount of control over. Think about in ancient Near Eastern religions, if you name a god, you can invoke that god, you can call down that god, you can invoke that god for magic, right? And so God's still remaining somewhat aloof. And it's not until we get to Moses that we find somebody with whom God is comfortable revealing God's name. But at this point, God evades that, right? And leaves. He blesses Israel and departs. And it's after this encounter that Jacob meets Esau, and there is, in a sense, some kind of reconciliation. Jacob, they kind of make right, and Esau even says, "Hey, let's go together to this place. Let us now become one family unit. Let's kind of reunite." And Jacob's like, "Okay, yeah, you go ahead. I'll meet you down there," and then he goes somewhere else. Right. So Jacob still hasn't completely shed this trickster identity, right? But there is a sense in which he one kind of poetic way of putting it is goes limping into the promise, right? He has been now kind of named and owned and given this new identity in the covenant. And we see his attitude somewhat change, right? We see his attitude change. He goes to Shechem after he kind of tells Esau to kind of go on his own. And he goes to Shechem and he comes to a new place, sets up an altar, and calls it El Elohe Israel, which means God is the God of Israel. Right? So interestingly enough, after this encounter, there's something about this encounter with this man and the encounter with Jacob that now makes him comfortable to enter into the covenant. Right? He has the birthright, he has the blessing, and now he's kind of claiming that identity that he's been given. Okay. Now, Jacob kind of becomes... Oh, actually, hold on, real quick. Before we move on from here, let me see how we're doing on time. 35. Cool. This identity in Jacob, right, is this idea of wrestling with God. So it's interesting that we have now, this third character is something between Abraham and Isaac. We no longer have this completely passive faith or submissive faith that would just do whatever, right, as Abraham was kind of representing. But no longer do we have this completely passive character like Isaac. Here we have somebody who's wrestling with their identity, right? Wrestling with who they are. Not exactly a model character, but yet someone who is still willing to be part of this covenant. Okay? So you've got these little matrix sheets, these little half sheets of paper. So let's kind of recap in our heads how all of these three patriarchs are representing Israel. Okay, so let's just start with Abraham. What's Abraham's defining quality?
Faithfulness.
Good, faithfulness. What's a or a couple stories that represent that quality, that show us that is his quality?
God told him to go.
Right, ascending. What would be possibly another one?
His son.
Yeah, the binding of Isaac. Good. Now, what is that saying of Israel's identity? How are they painting their own selves through Abraham?
That they're faithful to their God.
Okay, so Abraham as kind of the prime example of faithfulness.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Do they look at themselves and these three people are a spectrum of where they can be with God, or?
Think of it as, I think we mentioned before, of being, knowing who you are, knowing who you want to be, kind of that space. Yeah, so something like that. Struggling with these different identities, should we be like this? Are we like this? Maybe this is who we are. Just trying to express their identity through these stories. Yeah.
Okay, because a lot of times it's referred to as God of, he's referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
Is that kind of saying, well, because of the differences in those three personalities, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that if God is the God of them, you know, when we are like that, the nation of Israel, God is still our God.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. The text kind of constantly, throughout the Hebrew Bible, uses that phrase as a shorthand way of saying the God of Israel, right? The God of these people. And each of those three people are the patriarchs. And so in a sense, those three people kind of encapsulate who Israel is, right? Encapsulate this story of Israel's beginnings, right? So yeah, so it's in a sense that don't make it too kind of abstract, but in the sense of God is the God of these three very important people that are kind of, in a sense, summing up Israel's identity, right? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Another thing we can write with Abram is in a sense a foreigner, right? Israel recognizing itself as a people who have been given their space, right? Remember with Abraham, that is whom God promises a land, right? But he is one who comes from not that location, right? He is called forth from a place to go to this new place. And so this is kind of Israel's identity as well, right? Strangers in a strange land. They're kind of like resident aliens in a sense. Okay? And Abraham is kind of encapsulating that identity as well. This idea of resident aliens. We are people who have been brought into this land even though we are not native to this land. This land doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God who has given it to us. Okay.
I don't know what word defining Israel, like which, right?
Defining Israel? Well, we have the sense of Israel is a faithful people, and you could say Israel is resident aliens, if you wanted to kind of like sum up those ideas. Good. Isaac. What is Isaac's kind of defining?
Passive.
Good. Passive, but what else? Because Israel isn't, and this is kind of an interesting one, because Isaac, as far as equality goes, remember, we're not so much looking at what he does, but who he is.
He's the covenant.
Not just the covenant. Keep giving me more than that.
Promise.
The promise, the covenant. But think of what's cool. Let's think of this. What's kind of his defining story?
As far as who he favored?
It's as far as who he is. Where do we get kind of the picture of who Isaac is that really matters?
He's brought up to be sacrificed.
Yes.
And he does not struggle with it. He just.
Well, we don't know. And that's what's interesting. We don't know what he does. But I think you're exactly right in that his defining story is the binding of Isaac. Right? This is very much kind of where we see Jacob's character.
His defining story is what?
Yeah, so his defining story, Isaac's defining story, is the binding of Isaac, right? The Akedah.
Is the binding of Isaac.
The binding, yeah, B-I-N-D-I-N-G.
Wait a minute, whose defining story is this?
Isaac's.
Isaac's
Yeah.
defining story is his binding.
Yeah. Remember, because Isaac isn't an active character much at all.
Yeah.
But it's in the binding of Isaac that we really see what the text wants to do with his character.
Okay.
Right? Because it's not anything Isaac does. Right? Nothing in this text that we've seen really like shows us anything special about Isaac. Because it's his identity as not just the promise of the covenant, but the promise endangered. That's really Isaac's defining characteristic. So if you want to put that for the defining quality, Isaac is the promise endangered.
Isaac is.
The promise endangered? Yeah.
That's what defining quality?
Yeah.
The promise of what?
Endangered. Promise endangered. Right? And what would be, and so in a sense, we can just kind of write this as well with how Isaac defines Israel. Right? As a covenant people who feel themselves endangered and hope for deliverance. You see
What's
themselves,
the defining story?
the defining story is the binding of Isaac, right? The Akedah. how they kind of how Israel is painting its own self-portrait through Isaac, right? Kind of narrating that idea that we feel like we are a people who are constantly in danger of being wiped out, and yet there's this hope held on to that there will be provided a way out of this through God's divine action.
Okay, so what did you have for Abraham? You had defining quality for faithfulness, right?
Right, and a resident alien, right? This one who is called out of a land and being given another.
Resident alien?
Mm-hmm. And so finally we get to Jacob, right? What story of all the stories we kind of ran through today seems to be a very defining story for Jacob?
He wrestles with the man.
Yeah, the wrestling at Peniel. And Peniel is just Peniel. Peniel.
Defining story.
Yeah, it's kind of that's his defining story. Right? Is the wrestling at Peniel. Okay. What kind of qualities about Jacob do we see a lot?
Trickster, liar.
He's a con artist.
Yeah, trickster, con artist.
That was his wrestling opinion, was his defining
Defining story, yeah. That story in the text we can really see a lot of his character in. Right. And we can also even say, kind of along with this wrestling, is his wrestling with his identity. Right? Wrestling with what's required of him.
Wrestling with the covenant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, how does Israel kind of narrate its own self-portrait, its own autobiography through Jacob, who becomes Israel?
Their struggle with the covenant.
Yeah. It's just a good shorthand way of putting it, right? Their struggle with their covenant, their struggle to be a faithful people, right? The struggle to be the people who aren't just trying to get the goods out of this, who aren't losing the focus on just wanting the property and kind of the status, but being a people of the covenant, right? Being involved in that relationship and what all that requires.